Good evening, good afternoon, Dr. Joseph Martin. Credit card debt, the banking gulag. This is part two of four parts. The first part was this particular video called Making Money Through Soul Gold Alchemy, and you might want to watch that. And part three will be on the mental health and emotional health issues of debt, and part four will present personal and family and social solutions to our dilemma that we find ourselves in. So, credit card and other bad debt, the banking gulag. Gulag is a term that we've had since the middle of the 20th century when Alexander Solzhenitsyn wrote that trilogy, The Gulag Archipelago, about his many decades in a Stalin concentration camp. And we could say that the debtor's prison that the majority of people in Canada, the US, and the world, in fact, particularly in Europe, find themselves in is really a gulag or a prison set up by the banks and all the banks of the world, we might add. How is this so, and what is this all about? Well, that's what this video attempts to explain for us. I would say that this banking debt or the credit card debt that majority of us, the people, have right now is like the new Black Death plague that we had in the 14th century in Europe, which killed millions of people, in fact, more than half of the population. This credit card debt now has a potential to ruin and cause complete havoc in the lives of more than half of the people in Canada and America, and that would be tens of millions of people. Maybe you find yourself to be one of them anywhere in the world where you are. This depression now, since 2008, which has been a global depression, is perhaps going to be worse than the one in the 1930s. And we'll understand that as we go through these oncoming videos. From morning till night, most individuals, perhaps you listening in now and watching this, get up in the morning wondering how you can find more money, find more cash, get more money, get a job that pays more, get a second or a third job, or pay off your student debt. And the last thing you might think about at night is how you can do this, and it might spend some sleepless nights or many sleepless nights trying to figure this out. The fact that it causes great depression, fears, and anxieties, and shame and guilt will be the subject of our third video on this topic. Now, the banks have been called bottom feeders. They've been called rats. We're not talking about individuals necessarily. We're talking about the corporations that are the banks with all the profits that they make. They tend to make money and think of the bottom line only the single bottom line in one way, in that they charge extra fees on your account. We're talking about credit cards now. If you have a payment that's late, they charge $43 typically. If you are gone over limit on your credit card limit, they charge another $43. And they do this on a monthly basis, so you may end up paying, if you haven't paid the minimum monthly payment, of over $86 every month, and that goes on your account. Along with, they charge you interest for unpaid balances. Now, it just so happens that many people need to use credit cards. We're accustomed to using credit cards now in the world for the last 80 years. In order to make ends meet. Maybe we've stretched beyond our limit, maybe we're not balanced and wise in the way that we spend our money, and we use credit for money that we actually don't have, which was very unwise. More of that in another future video. And we tend to, we're very unconscious people, aren't we? We tend to not think about the most important things in our lives, and the things that cause us the greatest worry, often we like to shove under the rug and not think about until someone comes knocking on the door. Meaning the creditors, or the credit card companies, or the collection agencies, or in fact the people from the banks who foreclose on your home. But why is this unfair? Well, it's unfair in the way that the banks try to get your business. They say that they'll go back and back for extra customers that they've lost, and they always send you mail for things that you don't need. All the banks do that to offer you credit cards, even though you may certainly not be able to afford yet another credit card. In this sense, it's quite immoral, I would suggest. They tend to feed on the people who can least afford it, and that would be the people who are poorest from the lower classes, and even now the middle class, the colored people, the First Nations people, people who they deem to be uneducated and simpletons. How unfortunate for them to think that way. And also for people who are young, who are students, who are you millennials in the world. They tend to pick on people who are going to college and university, people who they think will get a good job and be able to pay it down or pay off some of their credit cards over their lifetime. And I will mention that bad debt for you millennials is going to be far worse than it was for the boomer generation, and you really sincerely need to take some precautions and wisdom and knowledge about how to move through your lives so that you will be able to afford everything you need and not go overboard. How does this work? Well, I'm just going to share a couple of stories with you that I just heard about yesterday. The first story is about two young students in university in Oklahoma. One is a young man and another is a young woman. And I heard stories from their mother that I was watching on a video that I saw. And what was happening was these young students went to the first year of university or college, and what happened was they got inveigled by the banks who were there in Frosh Week to ask them if they wanted to have credit cards. Well, as it turned out, each of these two students, and this happens to many students around the North American campuses and worldwide, I'm sure, they got too many credit cards. They started using the credit cards. They weren't having enough income from their part-time jobs. Long story short, after 2 years, both individually of these students committed suicide. There is so much anxiety, depression, shame, and guilt around not being able to afford all the things you need and pay down your credit cards. Does this concern the banks that people are actually committing suicide? Well, that's a question I'll just leave open. There was another case uh, where another woman who had so much credit card debt she drove her car into the Ohio River and she drowned herself. They didn't find her body or her car until 2 years later. You can see how serious all this is. Now, the only way you can get out of credit card debt is to declare bankruptcy, where you don't have to pay back all of the debt that you've incurred through credit cards or other bad debt means, through other borrowing, your lines of credit, and so on. Now, this is increasingly a way that many Canadians and Americans are choosing to go in order to start fresh with their world and their businesses and their cash and their income and income flow. However, in George Bush's Jr.'s reign as President of America, he signed into law some new rules which makes it more challenging and difficult for people to use bankruptcy as a way of getting out of their debt. So in fact, most people, whether you're boomers or X generation or millennials, you will find, if you're not careful and wise, and again, we're going to have a future video on this, that you will be paying off your student debt, your credit card debt, and all sorts of other loans and bad debt for the rest of your lives. And the only thing, other than bankruptcy, that will stop you or allow you to get freedom again from this prison, this black death, is physical death. And God willing, it won't be suicide because there are ways through this. Nevertheless, most Canadians and Americans, even if they live to be 80 or 90, will still have some debt upon their physical death. quite a chilling statistic, in fact. Now, the interest that you pay on your credit cards is twice as much as the principal. If you only pay the minimum monthly payment on your credit cards every month for the rest of your life, let's say the principal is $1. On an increasing basis, you will find that the interest and the late payment fees and the overlimit fees will be $2. So what you really owe is $1, but in fact, with all the extra fees, it'll be $3. So you're paying back 3 times as much as what you owed originally, and that's what makes it so difficult for people over their lifetimes to pay off their debt. Obviously, we need some solutions, and that will be in part 4 of this series. Now, there are people who are debt option companies who will buy your debt, and then they'll sell it to somebody else and make a profit on it. So it's like a debt dating service. What they do is they'll buy your debt and they'll say that they'll unload it from you, but then they'll sell it to somebody else and they'll make a profit, but you still have the same issues with your debt and your own set of values that you need to have changed. So in a way, it doesn't really help you because those same banks who you unloaded the debt from, they'll send you new credit card applications to start all over again with that. And I'm not going to name any banks here, but you know the ones that I'm talking about. So there's quite a scam here. There's quite an immoral kind of ongoing system that is predatory for all the individuals, and it's not very compassionate. It's just making use of them to make profits for the people in the banks and these companies that buy and sell debt. There's something that the US government, and I'm sure the Canadian government to some degree, has been doing called debt surfing. Debt surfing is when a national government has so much debt, and there are other countries around the world who do this as well, that they borrow money from Social Security pension funds of the people, and they use that money that they borrowed and just give them an IOU, which is really meaning nothing. It's just a piece of paper. And the governments use that money to pay down just the interest on the national debt. And as you know, in America alone, it's in the trillions and trillions of dollars. All the presidents since Reagan up to George Bush Jr. have done this. And George Bush Jr. apparently borrowed Social Security pension money and drained all the pension fund and borrowed $800 billion to pay for the war in Iraq and all the other interest on the national American debt. There's something called the FICO score, which, you know, if you ever try to rent a home or buy a property or get a new job, and the FICO score is run, it's this score that shows how good or bad your credit rating is. There are many companies who do this. One of the primary ones is Equifax, and it's probably a popular one in Canada and America. These companies actually can take all the personal data from you, from your birth, and even from your parents and grandparents, and they've been doing this for over a century now, to find everything. If there's a point of sale that you've bought something, they know every little thing that you bought, where you bought it, when you bought it. Every bit of personal data is incorporated into your file on Equifax. That being the case, we know for a fact as well that there are many inaccuracies in the file that these companies hold. People with a same or similar name, or sometimes even a name that isn't at all similar, all their information and their bad debt or bad credit are in your file, and it's quite inaccurate. So your score can be pulled down by very virtue of the fact that you've got somebody else's bad credit there in your file, and that pulls your score number down. If you ask to have this removed, they will refuse to do it. The only people they actually do it is for the very, very wealthy and elite who make sure that there's nothing untoward or not personal in their own FICO score and their personal file. This is quite unfortunate, and even a more unfortunate part of it is that these companies can and do and will sell or give your personal information to companies and governments and military and sheriff's offices and police offices without you knowing about it. So this is not protected in the Constitution in Canada or America. And in a sense, it's like saying you have no right to privacy, which is a big issue in the last 30 or 40 years in our Western democracies. In essence, there is no right to privacy in the way these things are being dealt with and handled at this time. So, having said all this, I've been reading a lot of books on these topics. The Democratic senator from, I believe she's in Massachusetts, Dr. Elizabeth Warren, who is a specialist and an ex-professor on this topic, suggests that we have no personal exit strategy for our bad debt, and we have no collective or national strategy at all for our collective and bad debt. So this really means that all of us, both individuals and our collective and our nations, are in a debtor's prison. We're in a gulag of our own making, and the only thing that will resolve this is for us to take some time to look at the knowledge and the wisdom and to change our habits and take some action around all of this. So this will be now the end of our part 2 of this series, and there'll be lots for you to reflect upon. I suggest that you share all this knowledge with your people, your friends, and your family, and you can pass this video on, pass it forward, and then stay tuned for parts 3 and 4, the ones on mental emotional health and the ones with forward-looking positive solutions. Thanks very much, Dr. Joseph Martin. All blessings and all love and all support to you as you progress and you take back your personal, financial, fiscal freedom and independence.